The winter of 1932 was not the worst winter in Appalachian memory. It just felt that way. By December of that year, nearly a third of the rural counties across western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee had households that had gone 2 or more months without any reliable cash income. Farms that had operated for 3 generations were being walked away from. The county extension workers who travelled those roads in the early 30s wrote about it with the flat, careful language of people trying not to say how bad it actually was. But there was a pattern in who was eating and who wasn't, in who was trading and who was going without. It showed up quietly, consistently, across those records. The families who were making it through, not comfortably, not without hardship, but through, were disproportionately the ones with 2 or 3 beehives at the back of the property. Not because honey sold well. It didn't. Not because they had more land or better equipment. Most of them had less of both, but they were doing something with those hives that went far beyond honey production, something that had been built up across generations of watching, adjusting and converting every piece of biology the colony offered into something useful. Something that the beekeeping culture we know today has almost entirely stopped doing. What exactly that was, that's what this is about. The Hu Amphizama. If you've ever wondered what beekeeping looked like before there was a catalogue to order from, before there was a commercial answer to every biological problem, leave a thought in the comments. And if this kind of history lands right, a subscribe helps this content reach other beekeepers who think the same way. Now, let's start where the Depression beekeeper started. With nothing. The first thing to understand about Depression-era beekeeping in the rural South and Midwest is that the people who kept bees had not planned to keep bees. Most of them had inherited a hive or two, or they had seen a swarm land on a fence post in April and made a decision on the spot. A standard Langstroth hive body in 1932 cost between $2 and $3 new, more than many families spent on any single item in a month. Nobody was ordering equipment from a catalogue, so they built what they had. The had, Verhandthorns enthema. Verhandthorns enthema sals, you omfille with embeamtwars. Han the these, one days and me 9 twalmuba. The scrap wood hive was not a compromise. That needs to be said directly, because the instinct today is to look at salvaged lumber construction as a workaround, a second best answer to a proper commercial hive. But the biology doesn't support that framing. A honeybee colony in the wild selects a tree cavity. It doesn't select based on the quality of the wood, it selects based on interior volume, entrance size, and the degree to which the cavity can be sealed and thermally managed. A hive built from barn siding, old fence boards, the sides of a broken tobacco crate. If the interior volume is correct, and the seams can be closed, the bees don't care what the walls are made of. The Depression beekeeper understood this without ever articulating it in those terms. They built hive bodies with interior volumes roughly equivalent to what we now call a 10 frame deep, not from a catalogue dimension, but from watching what colonies had wintered in before. They made sure the bottom board was tight. They made sure the roof kept rain off, and the bees moved in and did the rest. The dimensional precision that modern beekeeping associates with the Langstroth standard was largely absent from Depression-era construction, and it was largely irrelevant to the colony's performance. This isn't an argument against standardization. It's an observation about what the biology actually requires versus what 40 years of commercial supply has led beekeepers to assume it requires. The hive was the easy part. The colony was the other problem. The hive was the other problem. In 1932, you didn't buy packaged bees, you caught swarms. Swarm catching in the Depression era was not informal. It was a systematic seasonal practice with understood social conventions. When a neighbour's colony swarmed, and in spring they swarm, there was an etiquette. You asked before you went onto someone else's land. If the swarm had landed on a public fence line, it generally belonged to whoever arrived first with a box. and a caught swarm in late April or early May was worth more than any purchased colony, because a caught swarm is a colony that has been selected by its own biology to reproduce in new territory. It builds comb fast, it lays fast, it expands fast, because that is the biological mandate a swarm is operating under. A caught swarm was also completely free. The Depression beekeeper, who caught 2 or 3 swarms in a spring, had acquired the equivalent of a substantial commercial investment, and it had cost nothing but a wooden box and an early morning. That is not a small thing. That is the entire entry cost of the operation, eliminated. Now here is where the management gets more specific, and where the knowledge these beekeepers carried becomes more interesting. Empty beehive equipment over summer is not benign. Any beekeeper who has stored supers or empty hive bodies in a barn or shed knows what shows up by August. Wax moth, Galleria melanella, a moth whose larvae tunnel through drawn comb, destroying in a few weeks what the colony spent months building. Depression-era beekeepers could not afford to lose drawn comb. Drawn comb is one of the most valuable things in an apiary, because replacing it means the colony produces new wax from sugar, and in 1932, sugar was not free. Protecting drawn comb through summer was a real management problem. The solution they used involved 2 things that cost nothing: salt and sunlight. Empty combs stored in a fully sun-exposed location, stacked on a pallet in the open yard, with the frames oriented so direct light hit the comb faces, were far less susceptible to wax moth damage than combs stored in a dark barn. Wax moth larvae are sensitive to both UV radiation and elevated temperature. A comb stack in direct summer sun reaches surface temperatures that prevent wax moth eggs and early-stage larvae from completing development. It is not absolute protection, but across a full summer, it dramatically reduces infestation rates. The salt component was simpler still. Lightly dusting the surfaces of stored combs before stacking them, not packing them in salt, just a surface application, created a chemical environment that discouraged egg laying. This wasn't a published recommendation from any extension bulletin. It was an observation that spread through rural beekeeping communities because it worked well enough to be passed along. 2 generations of beekeepers in the same county don't repeat a practice unless it produces a visible result. The families who lost their empty equipment over summer were the ones who didn't know about sunlight. That's not dramatic. It's just what the records show. And the families who entered each spring with intact drawn comb had 3 to 4 additional weeks of population building compared to the ones starting from fresh foundation. 3 to 4 weeks during a spring build-up before the primary nectar flow is not a small advantage. The other piece of Depression-era site management that doesn't appear in modern beekeeping literature is the deliberate positioning of hives near active compost and intensive garden plantings. This sounds almost too simple to be worth mentioning. The biology behind it is real. Decomposing organic matter supports higher soil moisture and sustained biological activity in surrounding soil, which extends bloom periods and increases nectar volume from adjacent plants. Depression-era farmsteads grew kitchen gardens out of necessity, not preference, and beekeepers who positioned their hives to work those gardens were accessing forage that was consistent, close, and managed. Unlike wild forage which followed weather and season without regard for the colony's timing, it wasn't science, it was observation over years. And the observation was correct. By 1932, white sugar had become a managed commodity in rural households. Not unavailable, but not something families were buying in volume to feed the bees when the family needed it for other things. The Depression beekeeper's answer for winter supplemental feeding was blackstrap molasses. Blackstrap is the final byproduct of cane sugar refining. Thick, dark, mineral heavy, and in the early 30s, cheap enough to be used as livestock feed. It was obtainable in trade in agricultural quantities. The question was whether the bees could process it adequately through a cold winter. The answer is carefully, and with timing. The answer is Offes tinenk. The answer is Offes tinenksing. Honeybees digest sucrose and invert sugars efficiently. Blackstrap molasses carries approximately 50 to 55% total sugars, primarily sucrose with some glucose and fructose, alongside meaningful concentrations of iron, calcium, and magnesium. The mineral load is the problem. Bees fed high mineral feeds in winter produce more metabolic waste than their digestive systems can clear during cold confinement. If colonies are sealed through a long winter on molasses as the primary feed, dysentery becomes a serious risk. The Depression beekeeper managed this not through chemistry, but through timing and dilution. Molasses was fed in late September and early October. Late enough that brood rearing had significantly declined, early enough that bees could still make cleansing flights before the first sustained cold. 1 part molasses to 3 parts warm water. Feeding stopped well before the first hard freeze. The colonies converted most of it before they went into cluster. The result wasn't as clean as sucrose syrup, but it was available, it was obtainable in trade, and used correctly, it was sufficient. This is worth holding on to. It was not a perfect solution. It was an adequate one. And the Depression beekeeper understood the difference between those two things, which may be the most underrated form of agricultural intelligence. Here is where the story changes character somewhat. By 1933, in rural Appalachia, the nearest physician was often 40 miles by road. A standard office visit cost $1, and in 1933 $1 was several days of field wages for many families. Medical care for ordinary illnesses and chronic conditions was managed at home. From what was available, and the beehive offered 2 things in that category that were both real and consistently used. Propolis, the resinous material bees collect from tree buds and bark to seal and sterilize the hive interior, has documented antimicrobial and antifungal properties. The flavonoids and phenolic acids concentrated in propolis, particularly from spring collections when bud resins are active, produce an extract that inhibits a broad range of bacterial and fungal organisms. Depression-era beekeepers made propolis tincture by dissolving raw propolis scrapings in grain alcohol, the same alcohol used for other household purposes. The resulting tincture was dark, strongly aromatic, and applied the way we would apply an antiseptic today. Small lacerations, skin infections, sore throats, early-stage wound management. This was not folk medicine in the sense of wishful thinking. The antimicrobial action of propolis was real. Eastern European beekeepers had documented its use for centuries before American farmers arrived at it empirically, and laboratory confirmation of those properties came much later. The Depression farmer didn't know the mechanism. They knew it worked on the infections that would otherwise fester into something serious. And then there was the bee venom. For I, sir, no, na. For I, sir, nigh, sir, for I, sir, theo, burse. No, na, nigh, sir, theo, I, sir, theo, nigh, sir, theo, I, sir, theo. For I, sir, theo, sucken, nigh, sir, theo. For I, sir, theo, I, sir, theo. For I, sir, theo, sucken, nigh, 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 sir, theo. For I. In the Appalachian tradition, A bee sting was not simply an occupational hazard of beekeeping. It was, under the right circumstances, a therapy. Deliberate application of bee stings to joints affected by rheumatism and arthritis was a documented regional practice well before the Depression, and it intensified through the 1930s as pharmaceutical anti-inflammatories moved beyond the financial reach of most rural families. The biology behind this practice is clearer now than it was then. Bee venom contains melittin as its primary component, along with phospholipase A2 and several other peptides. Melittin has well-documented anti-inflammatory effects in soft tissue. Phospholipase A2 triggers a cortisol-adjacent response in the treated area. Repeated venom application to chronically inflamed joints produces a reduction in local inflammation that often results in measurable symptomatic relief. Not for everyone. Not without risk. Allergic reaction to bee venom is a genuine danger, and the practice requires awareness of that risk at every application. But the Appalachian beekeepers using it in the 1930s were not improvising out of ignorance. They were continuing a practice that had been passed down because it worked, often enough for enough people to be worth the transmission. The hive as a pharmacy is the part of this story that most surprises modern beekeepers. It probably shouldn't. A colony produces 5 distinct biological compounds: honey, wax, propolis, pollen, and venom, each with documented biological activity. The Depression beekeeper had discovered, through necessity and observation, that 4 of those 5 had direct household health applications. They hadn't invented anything. They had simply not yet been told to stop paying attention to what the hive was actually producing. If this kind of biology-first approach to what the hive contains changes how you think about the apiary, a subscribe keeps this content coming. There's more where this came from. Now here is where the Depression beekeeper's management philosophy becomes genuinely counterintuitive. And this is where the question from the beginning of this starts to resolve. Because the families who were trading in the early 1930s, not just surviving but generating real exchange value in an economy where cash had nearly vanished, were not doing it with honey jars alone. The real income for the serious Depression beekeeper came from queen cells. Consider what that means. For everything the spion der om des Eimelsbier, a mated queen in 1932 sold for somewhere between 50 cents and $1.50, depending on region and stock quality. That sounds like almost nothing until you understand that a family working tobacco in eastern Kentucky in 1932 might earn 30 to 40 cents for a full day of field labor. A single mated queen represented 3 to 4 days of wages, and a productive colony in May, managed correctly, could supply multiple viable queen cells to a beekeeper who understood how to harvest them without disrupting the parent colony's function. This required specific biological understanding. A colony preparing to swarm raises multiple queen cells, typically along the bottom bar of frames, in response to population congestion and pheromone dilution. A colony naturally superseding an aging queen raises fewer cells, positioned in the middle frames in a more controlled biological sequence. The Depression beekeeper who wanted to sell cells for income had to learn the difference, because swarm cells and supersure cells have different viability windows, different acceptance rates in recipient colonies, and different implications for the parent colony's management. The timing of cell viability for sale, the transport in small nucleus boxes with adhering nurse bees, the management of the parent colony to prevent its swarming during the production period, all of this was biological knowledge that had a direct cash value in a market with almost no other consistent supply, and the material cost was zero. The queen cells were going to be produced by the colony regardless of whether the beekeeper harvested them. The skill was in reading the colony's intention early enough to manage the outcome. In 1932, that skill was worth more per hour than almost any other activity available to a rural household. The beeswax economy was less dramatic but equally consistent. Beeswax solidifies at room temperature into a stable, water-resistant material with a remarkable range of household applications that modern beekeeping literature rarely documents. Sealing canning jar lids with a thin layer of melted beeswax extended seal reliability through temperature fluctuation. Important in a farmhouse cellar, cycling through freeze and thaw. Coating sewing thread and twine in beeswax increased durability and water resistance. Relevant in any farm operation where cordage wore out constantly. Waterproofing boot leather with a beeswax and tallow blend reduced moisture penetration and extended the working life of a pair of boots by a full season. Beeswax candles burned longer, burned harder, and produced less soot than tallow. In a household where every material asset mattered, each of these applications represented real value. Wax also stored indefinitely. It didn't need to be eaten quickly. It didn't go off. In a depression economy where liquidity was scarce and barter was common, a pound block of clean beeswax was a stable unit of trade across the year. And then there was the last of the 10. The one that required the least equipment and the most patience. By 1935, white sugar had become genuinely rationed by price in many rural households. Not unavailable, but not a commodity families were purchasing freely. The Depression beekeepers' answer to sugar scarcity wasn't only honey, it was honey vinegar. The process is straightforward and requires nothing but honey, water and time. Diluting honey to approximately 10 to 12% sugar concentration and allowing it to ferment with naturally occurring wild yeasts over several weeks produces a weak honey wine. Exposing that wine to air allows acetic acid bacteria to convert the alcohol into acetic acid. The result is honey vinegar, sharp, stable, useful for food preservation, flavouring, and as a mild antiseptic rinse. Roughly 1 pound of honey per gallon of finished vinegar across a fermentation period measured in weeks rather than days. In a household where both white vinegar and white sugar were budget items, honey vinegar solved 2 shortages simultaneously. And the beekeeper who produced it in any volume had another consistent trade commodity in a local economy that was hungry for them. Nothing went to waste. That was the method. Fears nothing that. Let's go back to where this started. The winter of 1932, the Appalachian Hill Country, the Ohio River Basin, the tobacco counties of eastern Tennessee. The families who were making it through, what they were doing was not complicated, but it was complete. They had entered beekeeping at zero cost, salvaged wood, caught swarms. They had protected their equipment through summer with sunlight and salt. They had fed their colonies through winter on what was accessible: molasses, timed carefully, diluted correctly. They had managed colony health with what the hive itself produced: propolis tincture, venom, the colony's own biology. They had sold what the colony was going to produce anyway, queen cells, at wage-equivalent prices. They had converted beeswax into 7 or 8 distinct household applications, and they had turned diluted honey into a fermented acid that replaced 2 commercial products at once. 10 separate biological outputs. 1 hive, 1 season. Nothing purchased, nothing wasted. The Depression beekeeper was not running a honey operation. They were running an integrated biological economy, and the knowledge required to do all of this was already inside the beekeeping tradition. Already there, in county extension records, in the practice of older beekeepers, in the inheritance of management habits that went back 30 and 40 years before the Depression started. The Depression didn't create this knowledge. It made it necessary to use. What came after tells the other part of the story. As the post-war economy expanded through the late 1940s and 1950s, as commercial package bees became available, as treatments and supplements and replacement queens could be ordered from a catalogue, the calculus shifted. $1 spent on a commercial input was $1 well spent when the economy was functioning and the input solved the problem quickly. The multi-output management philosophy of the Depression beekeeper became, gradually, unnecessary. And once it became unnecessary, It stopped being transmitted. The catalogue replaced the ecology of the hive. Not because the biology changed, it didn't, but because the economy changed around it. When the industry told beekeepers there was a commercial solution for every problem, the knowledge of the non-commercial solutions quietly stopped being passed down. The bees didn't change. The hive didn't change. The biology of propolis, of venom, of wax, of queen cells, of honey vinegar is exactly what it was in 1933. What changed was whether anyone was asking the hive to produce more than one thing. If you've kept bees and found yourself using the hive for something beyond honey, propolis, beeswax, something you learned from an older beekeeper and never saw written down anywhere, I'd genuinely like to hear about it below. That kind of knowledge is still out there. It just doesn't circulate the way it used to. And if this approach to the hive resonates with how you think about your colonies, subscribing keeps this content coming. There's more forgotten precision ahead. The winter of 1932 didn't care about beekeeping theory. It cared about outcomes. The families who came through it did so because they understood, through inheritance, or through the hard education of necessity, that the hive was not a machine for producing one commodity. It was a biological system. And a biological system produces more than one thing if you're paying attention to all of it. The bees were still working through all of it. The question worth sitting with is a simple one. Of the 10 things the depression beekeeper was getting from those hives, how many are you currently getting from yours?